Welcome back to Kintsugi Heroes, helping people tell the stories they need to share so you can find the stories that you need to hear.
I'm so excited to share my conversation with Joanna Nell today. Jo, who is a doctor and an author, started her journey studying medicine in the UK and came to Australia as a doctor, caring deeply for her patients, especially in aged care. Jo loves understanding people, and it was that curiosity that led her to explore a hobby which became a phenomenon as a best-selling author. Her 5 award-winning novels, including The Single Ladies of Jacaranda Retirement Village, shine a positive and often funny light on ageing, encouraging us to think differently about getting older and the value of connection. Jo's story is about embracing change, overcoming self-doubt, and showing us that it's never too late to embrace something new and do it with a touch of hope and optimism. Please join me diving in and being inspired by Jo Nell's incredible journey. So, ladies and gentlemen, friends of Kintsugi Hero podcast, this is actually my excitement to talk to someone I haven't spoken to in ages, and there's so much to talk to. But initially, I want to tell the listeners that my guest today is an incredibly accomplished person, someone I look up to, not just because of her original profession, but because of the profession she's shifted to now, which I could not imagine doing, even though I probably desperately want to. So Dr. Joanna Nell, who is now Joanna Nell, author, writer, and expert on aging. Welcome to Kintsugi Heroes.
Oh, thank you, John. It's wonderful to be here. Wonderful to catch up with you as well.
Oh, thank you. I have to say you were instrumental in shaping my understanding of some serious thinking and chatting that we did once in a book club, which was like almost like a preview of the Ladies of the Jacaranda Retirement Village. But let me ask you first, you were a medical doctor working in various medical bits, but you spent some time in aged care and supporting the medical needs of people in that environment. But how did you become a doctor, Jo?
Oh, that's a good question. And it was so long ago. I think I was about 8 when I decided that I wanted to be a doctor. And I now can't decide whether it was because I had been in hospital having my appendix out and had developed a crush on the lovely young doctor, the house doctor who'd looked after me, and was just sort of desperate to get back into hospital somehow. Or whether it might have been a conversation with a teacher I'd had at school in far less enlightened age, where we went around the class and everybody said what they wanted to be when they grew up. And I said, I think I'd watched something on television the night before, which looked quite exciting about doctors. And I'd noticed that all the doctors were male and all the nurses were female in that. And I, just being a little bit of a contrary child, said, I want to be a doctor. And the teacher said, no, darling, you can't do that. That's a job for boys, for men. You need to be a nurse. And so I think there was just more belligerence in me than anything. If somebody tells me it can't be done, then I'm going to try damn hard to make sure it is. So that was it. And I think that just set me off on a course. Then, it was a seed that was planted in my mind. Whenever I mentioned it to adults, I got a good reaction back. It just became my path into that career.
That's so interesting, right? At an early age. And I love that there were multiple reinforcements, right? Both negative and positive for you choosing a calling rather than a career. But we so often see like the bright kids expected to become a doctor. And I've bumped into many of them that probably shouldn't have been, right? So perhaps their intellectual talents could have been pointed to some other place where they might have been a little happier and the patients a little better served. Do you think that was the right choice for you?
That is such a good question. Going back to your point, it's true. I think that if you were a bright kid in the 70s or 80s, then, you were set, would you want to be a lawyer or a doctor? I mean, there were basically 2 choices. I think that it was the right decision for me. I was really interested in people, and that was a sort of a curiosity that was born of being a little bit of an outsider. I suppose you'd call it social anxiety, and I was very shy and
Yeah.
bullied at school. And so I was the kid that was always on the periphery, looking in, looking for the clues. I suppose I
Mm.
might have a diagnosis nowadays, but trying to work out, how to interact with,
Yeah.
the other
Yeah.
kids. And this just led me to a lifetime of observing people and becoming really interested in what make them tick. So I was always more of a doctor that was interested in people rather than the pathology or the diseases. And yes, it was the right career for me for a very long time.
Yeah.
But I think that I gave it 150% perhaps. And so time came, I think, when my batteries were just
Mm.
run low, and there was an overlap of my writing and my medical
Mm.
career, but I don't regret it at all. It's been the most wonderful privilege. It has been a fantastic career for me, but I'm now no longer practicing for various reasons.
It's always strikes me almost like two paths, right? The human and the clinical, right? And perhaps, a very few doctors sit comfortably in both pathways. From your actual experience, do you feel that, that observations, has some validity?
I think that is a valid observation, John. And I certainly can identify colleagues and people that I was at
Mm.
medical school with who were very interested in the physiology, and they had a sort of a very scientific and methodical and mathematical
Mm.
approach.
Mm.
I wasn't so good at maths. I was very good at English at school and language. And I think that we naturally gravitate towards where our strengths are. So I think a lot of them went into careers, perhaps surgical careers. It's
Mm.
really good to have somebody in orthopedics who's good at angles, very
Yeah.
precise. And perhaps it's very good to have somebody in general practice who is interested in that sort of cradle to grave and the story of somebody's life, and, who uses their different skills. And I think that that's the beauty of a career like medicine, is that there is a specialty
Mm.
for everyone. But I do think general practice and psychiatry do tend to attract those who are more driven by the sort of the narrative rather than the pathological.
You talk about GPs and being connected with people and you watching people out from outside, the acuity of that, right? Your ability to see people, both the humanness and also their context. Is that medicine? Like, we often think about drugs and, surgery, cutting open or attaching or detaching things. But isn't everything context about, the person? Isn't medicine that?
Yeah, look, I feel quite strongly about this, that we are losing the art of medicine, which
Yeah.
is using all of those skills, that sort of observation, and not just the ability to see people, to actually get inside their heads.
Yeah,
All the
wow.
things you will
Yeah.
notice are also skills that you need as a writer, but get
Mm.
inside their head and to use a degree of intuition as well. And I think in our very evidence-based, protocol-driven medical world now, which certainly has its advantages, but I think we're losing a little bit of that
Yeah.
art of medicine, which is sort of indefinable, really. And I think that's what I really loved. I think I loved putting those skills that weren't necessarily quantifiable into those everyday consultations.
The acuity that you displayed to diagnose people, being brought to the framing of people in your books, right? So, almost their aspects, their ability to be sort of appealing is their humanness
Mm.
in your world.
Yeah, and I think that being a doctor, we naturally attune to stories. We're hearing stories every day. And I want to say at this stage, I have to reassure anyone who has been one of my patients that you're not in a book, because
No, oh yeah,
there is
yeah,
such a
crikey.
thing as the Hippocratic Oath, and
Yeah,
everything that
yeah.
I have heard in confidence stays there. But I felt that I take away the emotion and the essence of each of those
Yeah. Yeah.
consultations, and seeing the whole person as well. And as a writer, it's very important to understand the backstory. And
Mm.
this is so true of a doctor understanding a patient. It's sort of why this complaint, why this illness, why now? What has led, what has happened in their childhood, what wounds do they have, what has affected their physical health, their mental health, how they're seeking help. And this is where I did a stint in psychiatry in one of those wonderful old Victorian establishments, which was really quite revealing. And I really enjoyed that time as a young psychiatrist, because we would formulation around a patient. And it was, the P's, what are the predisposing factors? What are the precipitating factors? And, what are the perpetuating? What things are just continuing for this person to behave in this way, or to continue? So, and I think it's taking all of that into account. And naturally, that extends to creating those characters, because it's, using all of the senses and examining somebody, observing and listening, and putting those into characters as well.
What is psychiatry but the marriage between sort of assumption and intuition, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It was fascinating and sort of slightly terrifying as well. But I think that really did help me grow as both a doctor and a writer. And there's sort of no coincidence, really, that so many famous writers, actually started off as doctors as well, like Anton and I'm not putting myself in the same bracket.
Wow. Yeah. You and Chekhov. No worries.
I'm big noting myself here. No, not Anton Chekhov, Somerset Maugham.
Wow.
Arthur Conan Doyle. All of these people have started off as doctors and transferred those skills into their writing.
Into narrative. Right. Yeah. First of all, you were practicing in the UK and then came to Australia. Is there a difference culturally, that manifests in like being a patient?
Well, I think anyone who has been a patient in the NHS, and particularly the NHS of recently, the UK, will understand that, accessing healthcare is difficult. I trained in the 90s to become a village GP, and that's what I was. I had a practice, a partnership down in the New Forest before we moved to Australia in 2003, and that was the job that I trained myself really to do, and I loved it. And we moved to Australia supposedly for a year. My husband was seconded down here with his job, and it was absolutely wonderful. But the culture shock of moving to a health service that wasn't free at the point of delivery, but that was run by Medicare, was a very different model. The idea of charging people for healthcare was an anathema to me. I did take a long time to adjust to that, but I felt that the standard of healthcare here was very impressive. And I don't know what's happening with the NHS, but I just wish that we could apply some of the aspects of Australian healthcare. We're extremely fortunate here. We do pay for it, but it is world class.
Like every system, there's no perfect one, or at least no system operates perfectly. But, we sometimes forget to be grateful for an amazing thing. I personally was just involved in a period, and I sat back, had a chance to watch it over a few days from my hospital bed, being incredibly happy about the people involved in the system. Do you think people are called into health? Like, is it something that some people, like the nurses, put up with an amazing amount of kind of challenge and trauma? Are you called to do that regardless of the cost?
Oh, you have to be. You have to be. Certainly, nurses and, the vast majority of doctors are not in it for the money. They could take their skills and make a lot more money somewhere else. And I think that the reason that healthcare works as well as it does, really on the scent of an oily rag, thrives on the goodwill of the people who work in it, who see it as their vocation, who give above and beyond in terms of their hours and their, emotional involvement. So I think, if goodwill were to be withdrawn, the whole thing would collapse instantly. True. But yes, I think you have to be called. And, by the same token, there are some people for whom it's not the right environment.
Yeah, there's always people who get caught up in the momentum. I always think when I'm going there that I should be like bringing fruit, right? Because it's like that sense of you're doing this and not getting paid enough. Maybe I should sort of be offering the, like
No,
fruit
look,
basket or something.
I think they prefer chocolates, really.
Right.
But I think all that anybody asks is an environment where they are allowed to do their job,
Yeah.
that they're supported to do their job, that they're treated with respect, and that occasionally somebody says, thank you for what you do. And that's all it needs,
Beautiful.
just
A-
gratitude.
and a good reminder too of how we can support people. Just, occasionally the affirmation and admiration being passed on is
I think
probably
in
enough.
general, we don't tell people enough. You're doing a great job. You did a really great thing there. I mean, it is extraordinary what that can do for one person's, who may be having a bad day, who may be
Yeah.
struggling,
Yeah.
they may be thinking of quitting. And one person said, you've changed my life, or, thank you for what you do. You can't put a price on that.
Yeah, that's great. Going from that purpose-driven sort of, reminder, obviously it can be a bit of a stressful environment, but it's also, there's that level of gravitas that's attached to your activity in the health world. Did you find a purpose-driven motivation in writing, or was that a different experience?
Look, I think that's an ongoing process. And I think I've been confused about that for a while. And I was listening to a video by Elizabeth Gilbert recently, she
Yeah,
of the
well,
Big
yeah,
Magic fame, and she was
yeah,
talking about the difference between a hobby, which is something you do just for fun, there's no
yeah,
stakes with that, nobody recognizes it, you just do it. A job, which is something you just need to do for money. We all need to
yeah,
pay bills. It's not necessarily enjoyable. A career, which is a job you do, which you love, and you're willing to make sacrifices for, and a vocation, which is some sort of
wow,
profound calling,
yeah,
and you cannot not do it. It
yeah,
is your life's passion. And I think that my relationship with my medical job and my writing has changed. It's gone through a transformation.
mm,
It started off as merely a hobby, which I did, purely for my own
mm,
pleasure. It was actually quite therapeutic, really. For me, it's something I did to de-stress after work and sort of pour my feelings into my writing. And especially as someone who was kind of talked over as a kid and, wasn't really, I didn't really use my voice as a child. At sort of having something that nobody can take away the
mm,
words that you write down on the
mm,
page. It was great. And yes, medicine was my career and it was my vocation. But then, writing took on a little bit more, became a bit more of a job and then a career when I was published. And so the sort of relationship between all of those is ongoing because
mm.
now I've been lucky, I think, to have had two vocations, but at the moment writing is my vocation. And I think it always has been, but it's
Yeah,
just
yeah.
been pushed into the background and just kept as a hobby for a long time. It is now my career as well. It's my job too, which sometimes makes a difference when you're doing something purely for your own enjoyment on your own terms to dealing with deadlines and reviews and publishers
Commitments.
and
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
publicity and all that sort of thing. It can change the relationship with it. So I think I'm still working my way through that. And the one thing that hasn't changed is that I have suffered from lifelong imposter syndrome.
Yeah, yeah.
For 35 years, I felt a complete imposter as a doctor, even though I knew I was
Wow.
doing everything. I was doing a good job and people
Yeah,
told me I
yeah.
was doing a good job. I always felt like, any minute now, the alarm bells would go off and they'd sort of pull me out in handcuffs and say, what are you doing here? You don't know what you're doing. And it took me sort of 35 years to get over that. And I had just about, by the time imposter syndrome as a
Mm.
writer came along, I'm thinking, what am I doing here? What do I know about writing? So
You
yeah.
went and recreated the challenge just to make second half of life interesting.
Well, maybe it's part of sort of perfectionism, I think, isn't it? Perhaps is to constantly look at yourself and think, am I doing a good
Well, you,
job or
well,
not?
you mentioned, right, that perhaps the psychologist popped up just briefly because you mentioned diagnosable, right, which took me to the thoughts of neurodivergence. It's interesting you describe those kind of symptoms like as a child looking in, you were kind of an outsider trying to find your space. Intellectually knowing what you're looking at, but socially or emotionally unable to sort of find the slot. And then imposter syndrome is one of those things that constantly pops up for the neurodiverse and rejection sensitivity and so on.
Oh,
So,
yeah. Yeah.
Interesting choice then to go into a public, a career vocation job that says, please look at this that I've done and assess it and then tell me loudly exactly what you think of it. It
Oh,
must be
yeah.
very challenging.
It is really challenging, John. And I think, yes, look, probably I would have been given a diagnosis as a child. And I think that the reason my interest in other people was that I think there's something called hyperempathy
Yeah,
that
yeah, yeah, yeah.
neurodivergent
Yeah.
people can have. Anyway, look, the biggest challenge for me, I came out and proud as an introvert after reading Susan Cain's book. I don't know if you've read
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I have
Power of the Introvert in a World That Won't Stop Talking. And I thought, yay, this is my superpower, is to be an introvert. But standing up, the part of the writing process and publishing process, publishing a book that nobody tells you is that suddenly you go from being on your own with your thoughts, putting them on paper, to having to stand up in front of crowds of people and bare your soul. And, in my case, I've been very fortunate that my books have attracted media attention. And so I found myself on national radio and television. And it honestly felt like I was standing there kind of on the top of a speeding train, naked and,
yeah.
I was hurtling towards this. And I almost gave back my advance and thought, I can't do this. I cannot do this. And it was only working with a psychologist who specialized in helping people overcome their fear of public speaking that helped me to go through with it. And it wasn't necessarily a nuts and bolts public speaking. This is how you speak into a microphone. This is where you look or whatever. She was looking at everybody, individual psychology of why are you not this person who can stand up? What is in your past? What is that childhood wound, that belief, that false belief that you've carried with you all your life that means that you don't think anybody wants to hear what you have to say, or that that you're not worthy of standing up here and speaking to other people. So that was really a very valuable part of that process that allowed me. And of course, once you get started and you get practiced in something, it becomes so much easier. And now, of course, several books on, several years on, I am much more comfortable with that. It's one of the things about publishing a book that people don't tell you, that there are ups and there are downs. There are huge highs and there are actually really low lows that you can't voice because it sounds like ingratitude. But one of those, getting over that.
Well, that's something I've always wondered, because people own you once you hand them the product of your mind and creativity, the art. They feel like they've taken possession of it themselves. And then that gives them the right to comment, and
Yeah,
they can comment positively or
yeah.
negatively. I've always been interested. It's kind of like the author is not meant to be upset about being called all sorts of,
Mhm.
negative things, right? So do you feel like you can't respond, like saying get stuff that's not you're like that's not fair, or that's not nice, or
Oh, look, I often say I think you need a thin skin to write a book and a thick skin to publish a book,
publish it? Yeah,
because
wow, yeah, that's beautiful.
yes, you do. I mean, essentially, you're handing over a product.
Yeah.
I am very happy for the editing process. I find that very collaborative, very constructive. So I don't mind on an editorial level suggestions and comments. Sometimes, if there is a sort of a slightly negative editorial feedback, it usually arrives at 5 o'clock on a Friday evening by email, when you have the whole weekend to sort of simmer down
Yeah, 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 yeah.
and deal with those feelings. But they're usually right. And I think that you just have to get over the sensitivity and realize that it is a business after all. It's publishing is a business. And I stay away from reviews. If I'm going to believe the bad reviews, I can't pay any attention to the good reviews, which is a shame. Sometimes, my husband does filter out on Goodreads the good ones. But it's amazing, it's human nature. You can look at 10 reviews and 9 of them are 5-star, absolutely glowing. And then one, is less than flattering. And I know writers that have sort of given up their careers over something like that. And
Oh,
I
absolutely.
we're so sensitive to that, but that's what makes you creative people are, I think.
In some ways, Like say with people who have been diagnosed with ADHD and rejection sensitivity, dysphoria, that idea of that one review, right, can actually dominate someone's life, right? That they can ruminate and can
Yeah.
have an incredible impact on your ability to do something that you're good at again, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, the power of words, I guess, like that's your craft now.
And, not every book is for every
No.
reader. You can't, and there's never been a book that's had, glowing reviews from everybody, as many books as there are people. So I try not to think too much or dwell on that too much.
Extraordinary number of books, and I wish I'd read a lot more of them. One thing, going to your books, right? I always felt like Peggy Smart was the beginning, like the character that
Mm.
must have driven you to create.
Yes, dear Peggy. So she was the protagonist in my first novel, The Single Ladies of Jacaranda Retirement Village. And she's my every woman in a
Yeah.
way. I think I was writing that while I was working in aged care and doing a lot of my work in retirement villages. And she, in a way, she's not based on any one patient or person I knew, obviously. She's 79, turning 80, moving into a retirement village where she bumps into an old school friend, Angie Valentine, who has lived a very different life. And Peggy's forced to sort of review her choices in life to be a mother and a daughter and a wife, and to have lived a very quiet life where Angie has been this sort of jet-setting fashionista with a very different attitude
Yeah, yeah.
to aging. So I put everything into her. I mean, she has all the ailments that are,
A
or
bit of
the
imposter syndrome, a
the
bit of
limitations
yeah,
that
yeah,
every 79-year-old
yeah,
woman has. But I wanted to see her blossom, as like I wanted to see so many of my patients sort of overcome their internalized ageism and sort of get out there and do what they were still able to do rather than being told by society or their grown-up children that they shouldn't be doing this or they should be doing that. So yeah, she was the one who started it. Yeah.
I say that because I had a sense that I'd met Peggy, right, in conversation or in characters that you commented on in book club, right? And that fascinated me because you spoke about the medical role you had in the aged care and you were so caring for them. Was this a way of like solving, like you mentioned it, you're solving some of the problems when you couldn't do that physically, right? And you needed to emotionally.
Well, yes, look, that's a really insightful comment, John, because I think that's really one of the motivations for writing is that I can rewrite the narrative, I
Yeah, yeah,
can affect what happens to my patients. Sometimes it doesn't always feel like it feels like they just run off and do
yeah,
their
yeah,
own thing. Oh,
yeah,
okay, you're doing that, are you?
yeah.
Okay.
So
I
they
try
have their own sort of
they
yeah, yeah, yeah,
so much as I try and control them. But I think in a way, yes, subconsciously it is. It's a way of rewriting the narrative, controlling, what happens to people where, we can't cure aging, and I think that it was my way of just injecting a little bit of life and hope and optimism into that process through my characters. I noticed a definite divide in how people were aging, and I saw some who did it with gusto, very positively. They were sometimes a bit of a nightmare to their families and to everyone else because they were very driven to manage their own independence, to keep
yeah,
their own agency, even when it caused some problems, with mobility and that
yeah,
kind of thing. And others who seemed very resigned to it, very depressed with it. And of course, when old people moan and complain to their families don't want to visit them, they just complain about ailments. And we can't reverse the clock. But what we can do is look at what we can still do
yeah.
and do the best we can with that. And I'll just go into a bit of science as well. One of the interesting things about attitudes to aging is those who think more positively about aging, hold those more positive stereotypes about old age, are likely to live longer. And this has been shown in studies from Harvard, the Mayo
Right.
Clinic in
Yeah,
the
yeah,
Netherlands. It's been repeated. So thinking positively and optimistically can actually help you to live longer. And even people who have the gene for dementia, which is a very small number of people with dementia, those who are optimistic and think positively about their future with dementia are half as likely to develop dementia as those who worry about it. So how we think about aging really does affect how we age. And I think that's another reason for wanting to sort of tell positive stories, lighter, more humorous stories, is to take away some of that fear and dispel some of those myths around aging.
That's so important, what you just said, because it's accessible. We could, like, people say, what can I do about aging? Well, you can smile more, right? Or
Absolutely.
you can accept more, right? And that actually gives you a tangible benefit.
There's another study. Well, of course, I do have that science background, but there's a study that showed the quality of somebody's relationships at the age of 50 were more predictive of their health at 80 than their cholesterol levels were.
Wow. Wow.
So it's all to do with relationships,
Yeah.
community, and socialization. That is a huge thing. Yes, there's no smoking,
Yeah. But
exercise, alcohol, all those other things, but it is relationships and
connection.
community
Yeah.
and a
And
sense of purpose.
yeah, well, the study just out, I think the WHO, published it, that I've heard quote a lot because it's so pithy, right? That loneliness is equal to smoking 8 or 15 cigarettes a day, right? So, that, like, we talk about sort of that physical healthiness, right? But if you're, sit at home alone, sort of being depressed, you undo all that behavior anyway.
Oh, it is. When we talk about an epidemic of loneliness. In fact, I think there's a minister for loneliness in the UK, and
Yeah.
it does set up a stress response in the body, and that can lead to heart disease, diabetes, all those sort of metabolic things. And of course, loneliness is, could be an inevitable part of old age. We lose
Yeah.
friends and, our
Partners. Yeah.
partners and things. But that doesn't necessarily mean we have to be lonely. And the new book I've just written, sorry, I'm going to give
No.
the title of that.
The funeral crashes.
Well, it's called that. And it's not really about, death and
I
funerals.
love how you borrowed from Four Weddings and a Funeral for the tagline. It's beautiful.
But it was really based on my father-in-law's experience. He spent the last 15 years of his life as a widower. And he was a very gregarious man. He loved people. He loved intelligent conversation. And he found that the number of people who, he had to talk to were dwindling.
Yeah.
But the exception being at funerals, where he loved going to funerals. He said you'd always get a good feed. He was a Yorkshireman. You get good feed and a good cup of tea and a good chat. And so, in fact, I think once I'd sort of started thinking about that there's a whole scene of people who look for any sort of social event. And of course, the one that is popping into their, in their mailbox or their feed, with increasing frequency.
That's right. It's not like you're invited to weddings very often, are you? Yeah.
And so it's about, two lonely people who meet at a funeral.
And it's interesting because I was thinking when connection becomes even more significant from a holistic medical point of view, right? When being around people and maintaining relationships, has that immediate physical response in aging Australians, we tend to lock everyone up in a sort of, as Dame Edna said, the maximum security retirement village, right? And move them away from that multi-generational capacity. So, where did that come from? Why did we suddenly see them as kind of as inmates rather than elders?
Yeah, look, that's been happening for a couple of centuries now. That hasn't happened overnight. That sort of outsourcing of aging. I think there used to be institutions for there or living ending up in the poorhouse. And so the model of aged care has changed, and we tend to see it as this siloing, this sort of warehousing of old age. On the other hand, I will say that I've seen people who have been very lonely and struggling on their own in the community who have moved into aged care, into nursing homes or retirement village and have literally flourished
Yeah, yeah.
through company, maybe eating well. So, it can work. But I think you made that important point where, we are looking at a loss of that connection with other generations. And, we all saw that wonderful TV show, the Old
Toddlers.
People's Home for 4-year-olds
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah, yeah.
things.
Beautiful.
And, that was a social experiment. But gosh, what a powerful one.
Yeah.
We saw the transformation in there. So I think the model that we'd all like to see eventually would be some kind of multi-generational living. There are people who live with families when they're older, but I think, with both parents working and children being so busy now, it's very difficult. There's a lot increasing number of people waiting for home care packages because ideally people want to age in their own homes. But it's something that I think we need to address now, and the Royal Commission has been out for, a couple of years now. I think we're not moving fast enough to make those changes. And it's up to us, John. It's
Yeah.
up to our generation to say, if we don't like the look of what's ahead of us,
Yeah.
then we need to change it now. We need to vote with our feet and to think of more innovative ways of dealing with old age.
Yeah, we can't solve this problem using the same model that, got us into trouble. When you were caring for older Australians in that context, why would they enjoy life, right? Because we tend to think as looking in from outside or family members locking our troubled elders away, we tend to have negative connotations. What's the positive about, that you encountered, that you saw as you cared and helped them?
Well, that's partly why I began writing stories with older characters, because I was seeing these great stories. I was seeing one retirement village that I worked at, I would see them doing fashion shows and they would be in love in their 90s and
Yeah.
100s. And it was just glorious. And there was a lovely old chap who was an old veteran, Second World War veteran. And his way of, maintaining his independence, if you like, or doing what he loved was to get dressed up in his suit with his blazer, put his medals on,
Oh,
and
wow.
get on the bus. And he'd walk into the middle of the city in Sydney. He'd walk
Yeah.
around Hyde Park and visit the sites. And
Yeah.
people came up to him to talk to him.
Wow.
And that was his way of, seeing. He loved being out there. He,
Yeah.
didn't like being locked up, but it gave him a sense of freedom. So, look, there are challenges, and I never try and sugarcoat it, but those who aged with a little bit of, wry humor, were able to see the humorous side of things, find the sort of life's accidental comedy. They were the ones who seemed to get the most out of it. So I think it comes back to that attitude. I'm not saying that everybody can physically do things, but I think a lot was to do with, this is what I can still do. I'm not going to dwell on what I can no longer do.
Yeah. It's such an interesting point you make there, because it's a sense of, is that there's a point in our lives where we learn, either through reflection or through the evidence of our experience in life, aging is what you decide to make of it, right? That you like that comparison point between when you were young and then when you measure the loss of your capacity from like 25 or 28 when, we were, bulletproof and conquering the world. And then there's a point where you say, well, that's not the right person to compare myself against. It's, I need to compare myself against who I am now or who I want to be for the next, period of aging.
Yeah.
Is that part of something doctors or, people, support people or nurses in aged care can offer, right? That kind of support? Like, let's review aging.
Oh, I'd love to think so. And I tried to do that, one patient at a time. And I must admit, I ran up against brick walls. I had endless frustration, not with the individuals, but with the system and the facilities and just society's general ageism.
Yeah.
I found very, very difficult. But I think that we have to take individual responsibility for aging too. And aging is not something we suddenly think of when we
No.
get to 65.
No, no, no.
It should be something with, and this is where this multi-generational thing
Yeah,
is. We,
yeah,
because we don't see aging, we
no,
fear it.
yeah,
And we think, old age, it makes us think about our own mortality, doesn't it? We
yeah.
don't want to think about that. So we
Yeah,
don't.
that last 25
Yeah,
years
yeah.
always creeps up on us, doesn't
But
it?
I think, that I can look at somebody at 40 and tell how they're going to be at 80. Not all
Wow.
the time, but it's to
Yeah.
do with how much that person will prioritize their health and well-being, their stress levels,
Mm.
and setting themselves up with all the right lifestyle habit. I mean, everybody's very much into resistance training and weight training
Yeah.
and everything
Yeah.
at the moment.
And ice
I,
baths.
I'm not so sure about the ice bath.
No.
I haven't seen the evidence for that. I think the weights are a good idea. For the ice bath, I'm led to be convinced. I certainly won't be adopting that.
No, no, it's not
But I think
something I
it's
can do.
something that's, we are aging from the time we're born,
Yeah.
from the time our,
Mm.
little bodies come out. They are turning over cells. Cells are reproducing, but each time they don't do so accurately. And so it happens at a chromosome level, at a DNA level. But our lifestyle and our health habits influence that from a very early age as to how quickly we age. And so I'm not suggesting radical diets or, all the woo-woo sort of stuff that costs a lot of money. In fact, pretty much all the positive aging tips I can recommend cost nothing at all.
Oh, wow. There is a non-fiction book in you, like I think at that point, but
Imposter syndrome, John. I'm not qualified to do that.
I'll be the edifier and say you really have to, Joe. It's been such a great advice and insight. Your books of a theme are also really funny, and this is apropos of nothing. But are you funny, Joe?
I think I'm a lot less funny in real life than I am on the page. It takes me about 4 drafts to be funny, John. So
Right, right.
I love to laugh. I grew up with all those. My father loved comedy, all the
Yeah,
British sitcoms
yeah,
and
yeah. All
the
the
comedians of
classics.
the
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
70s. And my husband is probably the funniest person I know. I just love to laugh. And I think that when I became a doctor, I very much found that there was a culture of the sort of
Yeah, yeah,
gallows
yeah,
humor,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
a dark humor,
Yeah.
which is not necessarily cruel, but it's maybe feel inappropriate to those who are
Mm.
outside that. And I know that, there are a lot of emergency services and other personnel who have their own version of that. And it's a survival. You cannot go through life taking everything seriously because it's a recipe for burnout. So I have always looked for the humor, the comedy, and I've used it in medicine as well, that sometimes in a very dark situation, a sort of such humor sort of bubbles up and
Yeah,
it's an
yeah,
instant relief. It releases endorphins
yeah,
and serotonin and all those really good feeling
yeah,
chemicals. So it's almost like a prescription. I try not to, go for the one, two, three,
yeah, yeah,
stand-up comedian joke thing, but I try and bring out the humor to give light and shade in the writing. So I don't, I do tackle some pretty dark
Mm.
issues and I don't shy away from all those things. I've just written a book about funerals, but, I could only do that
yeah,
if it had humor.
yeah.
And, I think we all recognize that life is full of comedy.
On YouTube, there's a stand-up comedian. He must be 85 and he's super cool. And I just a joke the other day. He just said, he said, I've discovered Facebook and I was doing one of those surveys about, finding out your spirit animal. And he said, mine came back as extinct.
Can I steal that and put that in a book? I'll have to ask.
I'll tell you his name. He's very good. But it's interesting because you talk about that gallows humor, and I find some of the challenge watching it as I become older and actually become a better person. Gratitude drives me, and I find that replaces the need. So I see in the medical profession so often that professional detachment as a way of managing the vicariousness of their interaction with people who are suffering or trauma. I get it.
Yeah.
But is there a better way? Like I feel like gratitude and connection and sort of leaning into the humanness of people will get you appreciation back rather than just trauma back. Is that naive of me?
No, no, it isn't. They say, I can't remember who it was who said it described the sliver of ice in the heart. And I think, both
Yeah.
doctors and writers to a degree need that as a sort of protective thing. And I think that that's something I wasn't very good at doing. And that was ultimately
The burnout in
the
your
cause
life.
of my
Yeah, yeah.
demise was that my sliver of ice melted over the years. And I took on too much.
Mm,
I didn't protect myself. I didn't set up boundaries very well.
mm,
I got very involved
mm.
in my patients' lives and problems, and that led to my ultimate burnout. So I think there must be a balance somewhere. I think there are a lot of healthcare professionals who are on the verge of burnout at the
Yeah, yeah,
moment.
yeah.
And in fact, there's Dr. Hilton Copy, whose book, One Curious Doctor, has just published. I heard him speaking on Conversations with Richard Feidler, and I've been in contact
Mm.
with him. He actually was diagnosed with PTSD
Wow.
through his work as a doctor. It was not necessarily one
No,
act,
no.
but an accumulation of trauma over his career. And he sort of written a book about that. And he now runs writing retreats for doctors. And I think
Wow.
that that's where writing actually is a really powerful, I
Yeah.
would call it decongestant. That's not the right word, is it? But you
Well,
know what I mean?
like, yeah,
It's
like,
a medical term. But
yeah,
yeah,
it's sort of a de-escalator, isn't it?
it absolutely is. So I think that we need to look after each other better,
Yeah.
and we all recognize when somebody is heading towards burnout,
Mm.
which is why it's important, I think, it's easy when someone appears brusque and short and
Yeah.
to then be that in reverse. And so I think that's where we all need to be kinder, on both sides of that and both more understanding.
Wow. Yeah, absolutely. And of course, Kintsugi Heroes is built on exactly on that premise, right?
Yeah.
The stories that people share have the power to lift as well as release, right? So there's personal release and there's a community lift or inspiration or acknowledgement, normalization, right? Which are all good things, I think, for
Mm-hmm.
well-being. Incredible thoughts there, just on your books, because they are kind of related by the character, the stage of life, the sort of cuteness of their imperfections, right? Like the main characters are often kind of, having a thing, but they're not horrible things. Like their life and they're true to life, but they don't turn them into sort of, narcissists and all that stuff, right? So is that the place you like to be? And is that where the world you're creating and where we're going to join you and enjoy so much? Is that where we are?
I'd like to think so. I have a dark side like everyone. I remember the book that we met at book club. I think my choice was The Road. Was it To the Road?
Yeah, the road, Cormac.
Cormac McCarthy. That's
Yeah,
right. I mean,
yeah.
talk about dark,
I
post-apocalyptic,
remember that
whatever.
discussion. It was
So it
quite
was.
vigorous. Yeah,
It
yeah,
was. So I've
yeah.
moved on from that. And when I first started writing, I wrote the kind of stuff that I thought you're supposed to write, which is angsty and dark and a
Mm,
bit literary and,
mm,
lots
mm.
of
A tribute to
metaphors
our
and
intelligence and our
yes, yeah.
weariness. Yeah,
And I
yeah.
just found that that wasn't my authentic writing voice, which is a little bit more whimsical. It's
Mm,
playful.
mm.
And that's how I like to travel through life. It's not going to shield me from awful things that
No.
happen. But I think you can't change those things. What you can do is try and, skip along with it rather than let it drag you down. And that has just gone into the stories I write. Apparently, I write uplit. This is the genre I write in, which is taking somebody and it's not necessarily a nice, comfortable arc. It's
Yeah,
taking somebody
yeah.
with all the problems of the
Mm.
world and taking them through and giving them a sense of community and bringing a more positive. It's not always a happy ever after, but it's a sort of a more hopeful ending. And I feel that that's where a nice place that I'd like to stay in
Yeah,
life.
I really love it's demystified and kind of made it more accessible to me, right? The nature of like old age home, and like I'm kind of now planning the invasion I make on one now, right? At some point, right?
And you
So
escape, yeah.
yeah, I think that's just a wonderful aspect of it. Because in that realness, like in the identifiability that you've created, right, you've also invited us into
Mm.
that space of aging. And I think one thing that older people feel from my own experience and conversations is a sense that we've been uninvited from life, right? That we're not seen, we're not heard, we're not valued, and we have so much to give and so much to share and so much stuff that we're finally working out, and then we don't have an outlet to do it.
Yeah, it's sort of invisibility, isn't it? And that
Yeah,
sort
yeah,
of creeps up on you, doesn't it? And there's some aspects of invisibility that are quite good. You can nip down to,
yeah, yeah,
IGA in your Ugg boots and no one's going to
yeah,
notice. But no, I think to be overlooked and to be, devalued and dismissed just because of your age, when in fact we should be holding up elders. This is the thing about, our acknowledgement of country, which I think is absolutely fantastic and the right thing. But I wish that we would also acknowledge all elders
yeah,
and
yeah,
say,
yeah.
you have something so valuable to contribute. So it's really me shining a light into that dark corner. And the wonderful thing about literature is it's been shown to increase empathy in the reader. So, gosh, if we could all read a little bit more.
Yeah.
But it's giving somebody the opportunity to actually see the world of that person through their eyes, walk in their shoes. And which is why in my second book, The Last Voyage of Mrs. Henry Parker, that book, it's no spoiler, but that book is written from the point of view of a woman who's living with dementia.
Yeah.
So she has memory loss and she's trying to solve the puzzle
Yeah.
of where her husband is.
Yeah.
And we only see it through her eyes, which, it can be frustrating at times, but she runs rings around people and she still has that sort of agency. So, I don't want to think that the stories are all completely light and fluffy, but I think it's a way of making the issues more palatable, making life more palatable, and entertaining myself and hopefully entertaining the reader too.
No doubt about that. And I think that's so important because, while they might be difficult, premises, right, we're still human. We still have to live with that.
Mm.
So, it's real life, right? So it's so good. Even though if it's uplifting, it's still real life. So, and Joe, you are far too young to be considered, to answer this question. So just try to.
I think we're the same age, John.
Just try to, which means for me, you're way too young. So, taking that hypothetical, right? How do you feel you will age?
Isn't that an interesting question? How I'd like to think. Look, I have good genes to an extent. My grandparents have all lived to their 90s. My father's about to turn 90, and although he's losing his sight, is doing quite well. So I suppose I'm exploring this through the writing. There's an adage, write what you know. I don't. I write what I don't know. I'm exploring what my own future looks like. I can set myself up and try and do the right things. I'm lifting a few weights now and trying to look after myself and in fact prioritize my own health for it, which is a really interesting concept. But I hope that I can stay positive and connected, and none of us can, there's a lot that we can't prevent in terms of health and aging, but I just hope that I am that woman who tries to escape from her nursing home, or creating mischief as long as I possibly can, John.
Yeah, I love that. And what a way to finish up. Joe, it's fantastic. Thank you for sharing so much and for giving us so much insight into the process. That I'm so blown away by what you've created and how you support it and the industry of it. So well done. And not that you need my congratulations, but I really look forward to what comes out in the future and, something that I can then use to grow old disgracefully. So.
Well, thank you, John. It's been a really interesting discussion. So thank you very much for inviting me.
So thank you on behalf of Kintsugi Heroes. Thank you very much, Joe Nell.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Kintsugi Heroes. Thank you to Colin Lilly for permission to use Broken as our theme music for this series. If you enjoyed this conversation, share the podcast with a friend and let us know by leaving a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to support Kintsugi Heroes and the stories we share, head to kintsugiheroes.com.au and follow the instructions to make a tax-deductible donation. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.